Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army.
Thank you. It is really great to be here for this one.
Yeah, so welcome to today's deep dive. I'm thrilled you're listening, because today we are tearing into something really foundational. I mean, usually when we sit down to discuss how organizations operate, especially those dedicated to like social impact or frontline urban rescue, there's this really persistent expectation of structural simplicity.
Oh, absolutely. We want it to be simple.
Right. We want it to be like building a house. You know, you survey the land, pour the concrete, put up the walls, and you step back and say, there! It's complete, it's centralized, it's a neat little chart.
Yeah, it's a very comforting illusion. I mean, we are really drawn to the idea of a singular command center. We desperately want to believe that if you just draw a neat enough org chart, all the decisions are going to be made efficiently at the top, and resources will just perfectly flow downward without any friction.
But then you actually step into the trenches. You try to run a rescue mission in a dense city or launch a global initiative, and suddenly that neat blueprint is just completely useless.
Oh, completely. It goes right out the window.
The reality of organizational life, especially in faith-based missions, is just murky. It's full of tension and competing interests. Leaders are constantly tearing their hair out over this structural friction.
Right. It's the absolute definition of organizational muddy waters. And, the tension you're describing, it isn't a modern management failure. This is a structural friction that has been perplexing leaders for over 2,000 years.
And that structural friction is exactly what we are decoding today. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore a genuinely paradigm-shifting essay. It's by a man named Ralph D. Winter, and it's called The Two Structures of God's Redemptive Mission.
Which is just a brilliant piece of work.
It really is.
Yes.
And to help me navigate this massive historical landscape, I've got a resident expert here. Because honestly, to grasp the weight of this essay, you really have to understand the guy who wrote it. Ralph D. Winter wasn't just some armchair academic theorizing about org charts, was he?
He was the furthest thing from it, actually. Winter is such a fascinating figure because he lived his life right in the crossfire between high-level theory and, brutal on-the-ground reality.
Right.
He spent 10 years deep in the highlands of Guatemala working directly as a missionary among the Mayan Indians, so he knew exactly what it felt like to be totally detached from those comfortable Western support systems.
He really experienced the isolation and the resource scarcity of actual messy fieldwork.
Exactly, but then he pivoted. She spent the next 10 years as a professor of missions at the School of World Mission at Fuller Theological Seminary.
So he brought all that dirt from the field right into the ivory tower.
He brought the dirt, yeah, and he brought the rigorous analytical framework needed to understand it. And he didn't stop there either. He wasn't content to just teach.
Right, he was a founder too.
Yes, he and his wife Roberta founded a specialized mission society called the Frontier Mission Fellowship, which eventually spawned the U.S. Center for World Mission. Think about that trajectory for a second.
It's incredible.
He was a frontline practitioner, an academic scholar, and an institutional founder. He had this rare 360-degree view of how movements actually organize themselves to survive.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's lay out the central mystery that Winter's essay attempts to solve. Because this is something you, as a listener, have undoubtedly witnessed. You look at a massive, well-established local church or denomination.
With their massive budgets and thousands of people.
Right, exactly. Huge cultural influence. But when it comes to taking radical action, like, say, launching a new addiction recovery center or sending a team into a dangerous neighborhood, they are agonizingly slow.
Oh, painfully slow.
It takes like 3 committees, 4 board meetings, and a congregational vote just to approve a budget for one soup kitchen.
Because the machinery of a large organization just grinds to a halt when it's faced with specialized, risky tasks.
Yes. But then you look at the other side of the spectrum. You look at these highly specialized, intense, independent nonprofits, the rescue missions, the inner-city task forces.
The ones actually out there on the front lines.
Right. They're moving fast, adapting daily, taking massive risks, but they are constantly on the verge of total collapse. They are chronically underfunded, and the leaders burn out at terrifying rates.
Because they lack that broad, long-term community support.
Exactly. So Winter looks at this dichotomy, this friction, and he drops an absolute bombshell of a thesis. He says God has never relied on a single organizational structure to advance the Christian movement. He has always used 2 distinct, parallel structures.
And understanding the mechanics of these two structures will fundamentally change how you view every single organization you interact with. I mean, whether it's a local congregation, a global charity, or even a Fortune 500 company.
You just start seeing these two structures everywhere.
You really do. It explains the slowness of the megachurch, the burnout of the city mission, and even those explosive growth periods in human history.
So, to understand how this works, we need to master two specific vocabulary words that Winter introduces. They sound a little academic at first, but stick with us, because they're the master keys to the whole puzzle.
Right. The first word is modality.
Modality. Okay, let's define that.
Let's define it with some precision. Winter describes a modality as a structured fellowship in which there is no distinction of sex or age.
So like a typical local congregation or a parish.
Exactly, or a broad denomination. A modality is, by its very nature, a biologically perpetuating organism.
Meaning it's designed to encompass the entire human life cycle. You have infants in the nursery, teenagers in youth groups, single adults, married couples, elderly members.
Right, it represents the whole spectrum of human existence just living side by side. You're often simply born into a modality. It's the broad, inclusive community of the faithful.
So it's generalized. Its primary function is nurture, preservation, and just maintaining the cultural baseline of a whole population.
Exactly. Now, contrast that with the second structure, which Winter calls a sodality.
A sodality.
Right. A sodality is a structured fellowship that demands an adult second decision. It goes far beyond simply being a member of the modality.
Okay, so it's restricted in some...
Yes. It's usually restricted by age or sex or marital status or, and this is the most important part, by a very specific, intense vocational commitment.
I really want to focus on that phrase, second decision. That is doing a lot of heavy lifting here.
It really is.
It implies you don't just drift into a sodality because your parents took you there on Sundays. You don't end up there by default. Mm-hmm. You have to actively raise your hand and say, I am intentionally signing up for this specific, difficult, high-discipline task.
Right. An overseas mission agency is a sodality.
Yeah.
A specialized urban rescue task force is a sodality. Even a military special operations unit is a secular sodality.
And to really ground this in everyday reality, we should use Winter's secular analogy because it just perfectly clarifies how these two relate to each other.
Oh, the town and the bakery analogy. It's phenomenal.
I love it. Imagine the modality is a town. Every kind of person lives in the town. You've got the mayor, the city council, schools, elderly care, parks. The town has general governance over everyone who simply resides within its city limits.
Its goal is just the general well-being of all its citizens.
Right. But a sodality is like a private business. Imagine a highly specialized bakery or a chain of hardware stores that operates within that town.
What's fascinating here is analyzing the mechanism of their interaction. How did the town and the private business coexist?
Well, the town sets the rules.
Exactly. The sodalities, the private businesses, are regulated by the modalities, the towns. The town sets the zoning laws. It establishes the basic legal framework. It builds the roads the delivery trucks use.
And I think this is where the friction usually begins. The town does not administer the private business.
No, it doesn't. Because if the mayor suddenly decided he needed to personally manage the inventory of the bakery and decide what kind of flour to buy and dictate the work schedules of the bakers,
the entire town would collapse under the bureaucratic weight. I mean, the mayor doesn't know how to bake bread.
And the bakery would lose all of its specialized efficiency. Winter points out that when a central government attempts to run every single decentralized private initiative, you just end up with complete state socialism.
Right. When the town administers the private businesses, innovation dies.
The specialized energy evaporates. The symbiosis is the magic ingredient here. The modality provides the broad, nurturing, stable environment, and the sodality provides the highly disciplined, autonomous energy to execute specific tasks.
Okay, wait, let me push back here on behalf of the listener, because I can hear the objections forming from people who hold a very high view of traditional church structure.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very common reaction.
If I'm a senior pastor listening to this, I'm saying, wait a minute. The local church is supposed to be the ultimate authority. If the church is doing its job correctly, why do we need this second private business structure at all? Doesn't the existence of a sodality basically imply the local church is inadequate?
And that specific defensive reaction is exactly what has caused centuries of bitter conflict between church leaders and mission leaders. It's a very natural theological reflex.
Well, how does Winter address that?
He argues that to resolve this tension, we can't just look at modern organizational theory. We have to go back to the original blueprint. We have to examine the structural mechanics of the New Testament itself.
And when we look at the New Testament, Winter points out something that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. He says the early Christians didn't receive some magical organizational chart from heaven.
No, they didn't. They basically just borrowed their structures from the secular and cultural world around them.
Let's look at that. Let's trace the mechanics of the very first Christian modality.
Well, when modern believers talk nostalgically about getting back to the New Testament church, they're essentially talking about getting back to a Christianized Jewish synagogue.
Right, because when the Apostle Paul went on his missionary journeys, he didn't construct a new building model or invent a new gathering strategy. He went straight to the existing Jewish and Greek synagogues.
He utilized the architecture of the town that was already built. The synagogue was the ultimate ancient modality.
He was multi-generational,
Yeah.
old and young, male and female, the broad community of the faithful in any geographic location.
And even when Paul succeeded in establishing brand new fellowships groups made of both Jewish converts and non-Jewish Greeks, he built those new fellowships along the exact same Jewish synagogue lines.
That's the first structure, the modality. But then we observe the second structure functioning right alongside it, the very first Christian sodality.
And that structure was Paul's missionary band itself.
This is where the distinction becomes incredibly sharp. Paul's band was fundamentally different from the local congregation he left behind in Antioch.
The text highlights a really profound nuance here. Paul was sent off by the church in Antioch. They prayed for him. They commissioned him. But he was not sent out by them in the sense of being a direct employee.
He wasn't taking daily orders from a centralized home office.
Exactly. Once Paul and his team walked out the gates of Antioch, they were operationally autonomous. They didn't have to send a courier back to Antioch and wait 3 weeks for a committee vote to determine if they should travel to Ephesus next.
They made high-speed, tactical decisions on the ground. And their funding structure was entirely different, too.
Right. Paul's team was economically self-sufficient when the situation demanded it.
We always talk about Paul making tents, but we rarely think about the structural implication of that. He was operating a self-funding sodality.
They didn't rely on a unified denominational budget that could just be cut off if the elders in Antioch disagreed with his travel itinerary.
They functioned as a highly mobile task force based on a rigorous secondary commitment. I mean, you couldn't just casually join Paul's traveling band because you attended the Antioch church on Sundays.
No, you had to make that adult second decision to endure the shipwrecks, the beatings, and the starvation.
Which brings us to what Winter labels a shocking revelation. Neither of these structures was uniquely divine in its origin.
As Winter puts it, neither was let down from heaven in some exclusive way.
They were just practical, borrowed tools.
Exactly. God utilized the pre-existing secular and cultural patterns of the Mediterranean world. The Jewish synagogue had evolved organically over centuries during the diaspora.
Long before Jesus was born.
Right. And the concept of a traveling evangelistic band was also an established pattern. Jesus himself mentioned Jewish proselytizers traversing land and sea to make a single convert.
So Paul was simply taking an existing cultural form, the highly committed traveling band, and repurposing it to carry the Christian gospel.
And Winter uses a beautiful linguistic parallel to explain this. He points out that the Holy Spirit guided the biblical writers to use the pagan Greek word kurios,
which just meant master or a lord in the secular world.
Right. The early Christians took that common pagan word, threw it on the anvil, and essentially pounded it into shape to carry the massive weight of divine Christian revelation.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because structurally, they did the exact same thing. They took the existing cultural structures and pounded them into shape for their mission.
The practical implications of that for a modern leader are just staggering.
It means the New Testament isn't handing us a rigid, immutable organizational blueprint that we have to mechanically copy in every culture forever.
It gives us theological permission for what missiologists call dynamic equivalence.
Dynamic equivalence.
Which is
the freedom to borrow highly effective organizational patterns from our own current cultures, as long as they serve the same function.
Yes. If a modern, agile corporate task force structure or a specialized nonprofit model works beautifully to reach a specific broken demographic in your city,
you have the permission to borrow that secular form. You are corresponding to the function of Paul's band, even if the form looks entirely different.
And history proves that the form absolutely must change when the culture changes.
Let's talk about that. Because as Christianity exploded into the pagan Roman Empire, the old structures hit a wall.
The cultural context shifted entirely, so the structures had to adapt to survive.
Right, so the original modality, the Jewish synagogue, Christians were getting kicked out of the synagogues due to intense rivalry, so that pattern faded. They needed a new way to govern a massive growing population of believers.
So they looked out their window at the Roman civil government and borrowed its organizational chart.
They assimilated to the most efficient governance model available. The independent synagogue was replaced by a more hierarchical system.
Bishops began exercising authority over multiple congregations within a specific territorial jurisdiction, and the language they use reveals everything.
They appropriated the exact Latin word used for Roman magisterial territories, right? The diocese.
The diocese, exactly. And within the broader diocese, you had localized parishes.
So the diocese and the parish became the new town, the new modality. It still functioned the same way, old and young, male and female, but it was wearing Roman bureaucratic clothes.
But what about the sodality? What happened to Paul's traveling missionary band?
Because a small group of guys making tents can't systematically evangelize the entire continent of Europe.
No, they can't. So the small traveling band was replaced by a massive, widely proliferating structure that served the exact same high discipline function. I am talking about the rise of the monastic tradition, the monks.
Okay, we need to pause here and address the elephant in the room. Winter actually calls this Protestant culture shock.
It really is a shock for a lot of people.
When modern people, especially from Protestant backgrounds, hear the word monastery or monk, we immediately conjure up this very specific negative caricature. We picture weird hermits wearing itchy burlap robes, taking vows of silence, hiding in caves because they hated society and wanted to flee the world.
It is an incredibly persistent stereotype, and structurally it is completely backward.
So how does Winter dismantle this?
He uses hard historical data. Let's look at how early monasteries were actually formed. They didn't start as random gatherings of hermits. The monastic structure drew its initial inspiration directly from Roman military organization.
Wait, really? The military?
Yes. A key figure named Pachomius, who was himself a former military man, gathered 3,000 followers. And he didn't tell them to go sit in silence. He organized them with rigorous Roman military discipline.
Wow.
This highly structured system was then passed on and refined by leaders like Basil of Caesarea and John Cassian.
So these weren't just guys wandering the desert looking for visions. They were highly disciplined, intentional communities. They were the ultimate expression of this second decision.
You didn't become a monk by accident. You made a radical secondary commitment beyond just showing up at the local parish on Sunday.
And regarding the idea that they fled the world,
Yeah.
the historical reality is that they practically built the modern world.
Winter quotes historical analysts who point out that the Benedictine rule actually brought immense dignity to manual labor,
Which was despised in the ancient aristocratic Roman world. Manual labor was for slaves.
but the monks elevated labor to an act of worship. When the Roman Empire collapsed and barbarism and chaos swept across Europe, the modalities, the local parishes, were often too weak to maintain order.
So the monasteries became the sole centers of orderly, settled life. It's mind-blowing when you read the specific achievements listed in the text. It says they were assigned the duty of road building.
They repaired the roads when the Roman infrastructure collapsed.
They were pioneers in industry and commerce. Their localized, disciplined shops preserved the manufacturing industries of Roman times.
The text specifically highlights the French Cistercian monks, who basically function as a massive international agricultural sodality.
They led the agricultural colonization of Western Europe.
Think about the economic mechanics of a Cistercian monastery. Because they were celibate, highly disciplined, and shared all resources in common, they had virtually zero overhead costs compared to a traditional family unit.
So they could pour all their collective energy and capital into innovation.
Exactly. In Hungary and on the dense German frontier, the Cistercians were the ones clearing the forests and reducing the wild soil to cultivation.
In Poland, German monasteries introduced advanced artisans, craftsmen, and new farming technologies. They weren't hiding from the economy. They were the central civilizational engine of the entire era.
Going back to our analogy, if the mayor's town is burning down, the monks were the private construction company that came in and rebuilt the infrastructure.
And if that doesn't completely shatter the hermit stereotype, Winter drops the ultimate proof of their missional edge. The Celtic monks. The Irish Peregrini.
The Irish Peregrini are perhaps the most thrilling example of a pure sodality in Christian history.
These guys were absolute adrenaline junkies for the gospel. The text states they did more to reach out and convert the pagan Anglo-Saxons than any other force in history.
They single-handedly evangelized vast tracts of Western and Central Europe.
And I really want you to visualize this as a listener. These were not guys sitting in scriptoriums carefully copying manuscripts with feather quills. These were the ultimate high-discipline special operations task forces of the early church.
They would pile into tiny, fragile coracles, little boats made of animal skins, and willingly sail into incredibly dangerous, hostile territories dominated by violent pagan tribes.
They could do this precisely because they were a sodality. A local parish priest, a modality leader, cannot take his wife, his infant children, and his elderly parishioners, put them in an animal skin boat, and sail into a war zone to plant a church.
The biological organism is just too fragile for that kind of frontier assault. The Peregrini function exactly like a highly disciplined, highly mobile, modern mission agency.
And that is Winter's core, unyielding point for this entire historical era. Without the monastic structure, without this massive, relentless sodality, it is hard to even imagine the vital continuity of the Christian tradition surviving the Dark Ages.
The diocesan structure, the modality, was deeply compromised. It was often weak, politically entangled, or simply nominal.
Even the great theological scholars we revere today, men like Jerome and Augustine, operated from within these monastic sodality structures.
If you remove the sodality from this era, the whole enterprise collapses.
Which leads us directly into the massive structural crisis and eventual triumph of the medieval period. This is the era where the modality and the sodality actually figured out how to harmonize.
But the journey to get there was birthed out of sheer desperation.
Let's set the scene for the early medieval crisis. The Roman Empire in the West is actively disintegrating. And because the diocesan pattern had modeled its org chart so closely on the Roman civil government, they started breaking down right alongside it.
If the Roman magistrate loses his power, the bishop suddenly looks very weak. It was a time of immense structural vulnerability.
Furthermore, you had waves of barbarian invaders sweeping across Europe.
And the text points out a fascinating, terrifying detail. Many of these invading tribes were actually Christians, but they adhered to a heretical brand of Christianity. They were Arians.
So in many European cities, you literally had situations where there was an Arian church supported by the invaders on one corner of the square and a weakened Catholic church on the opposite corner, fiercely competing for basic survival.
It was an absolute free-for-all. And in this chaotic landscape, the monastic sodality pattern proved to be infinitely more durable than the diocesan pattern.
The monasteries were self-contained, self-funded, and highly disciplined. They became the true survivors, the preservers of the faith, and the sole engines capable of driving recovery.
And the absolute best illustration of this dynamic is the story of Gregory the Great.
I love this story. Gregory the Great's dilemma perfectly encapsulates the structural limitation of the modality. Gregory is the Bishop of Rome. He is the Pope.
He sits at the absolute pinnacle of the ultimate modality.
Right. But Gregory himself was a product of a monastery. His spiritual formation occurred within a sodality. Now, Gregory looks north toward England. England had been completely overrun by aggressive Saxon warriors who brutally suppressed the existing Celtic Christianity there.
So Gregory decides, we need to launch a massive mission to reclaim England and plant diocesan structures there.
But here's the critical operational dilemma he faces. As powerful as he is, he simply possesses no structure within the modality to execute a dangerous cross-cultural mission.
A local parish priest in Rome is not equipped, nor does he have the congregational mandate, to abandon his local flock, travel thousands of miles, and march into hostile Saxon territory.
Returning to our analogy, a town does not send its mayor to conquer and establish a new town in a hostile country.
The town's infrastructure is entirely localized.
So what is Gregory forced to do? He has to outsource the job. He calls upon his friend Augustine of Canterbury and recruits a team of members from a Benedictine monastery.
He has to deploy its sodality to execute the dangerous mission work.
And the profound irony here is that Augustine and his monks weren't going to England to set up independent monasteries. They were acting as the vanguard to establish diocesan Christianity, the very structure they existed outside of.
The sodality was the only tool sharp enough to break the hard new ground, so that the modality could eventually be planted and nurtured.
And Winter notes that the Benedictine rule, their highly disciplined way of life, proved so incredibly attractive that eventually Virtually all the Celtic monastic houses adopted it as well.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this specific interaction defines the greatest, most enduring achievement of the entire 1,000-year medieval period.
Which is what, exactly?
Winter argues forcefully that during this vast stretch of time, the building, the expanding, and the continuous rebuilding of the modalities was almost entirely the work of the sodalities.
The monasteries were uniformly the source of new energy and vitality that continuously flowed back into the broad, often sluggish diocesan side of the movement.
It was an incredible, continuous cycle of systemic renewal. Whenever the modality grew corrupt or lazy, a new sodality would arise to challenge it.
Like the Cluny Reform, which sought to free the church from secular political control.
Then came the Cistercians with their economic and agricultural mastery. Then the friars, like the Franciscans and Dominicans, who brought the mission back into the growing urban slums.
And later, the Jesuits, who became the intellectual and missional shock troops of the Catholic Counter-Reformation.
Every single one of these movements were strictly sodalities, highly disciplined second decision task forces. Yet they were the prime movers that rebuilt the Corpus Christianum, the vast network of dioceses.
Now, to truly understand how this synthesis worked legally and practically without the two sides destroying each other, Winter brings up a vital distinction in terminology. It's the difference between secular clergy and regular clergy.
Yes, this linguistic key unlocks the entire medieval power structure. In the Roman tradition, the priests who serve the local dioceses, who run the local parishes, are officially designated as secular priests.
Now, in modern English, we use secular to mean non-religious.
But in this historical context, from the Latin seculum, it simply means they live in the world. They are part of the general flock.
They are the town officials. They manage the daily life of the general population.
Exactly. Conversely, the priests who belong to the monastic traditions, the monks and friars who make up the sodalities, are designated as regular priests.
Why regular?
Because they are voluntarily bound by a regula. That is the Latin word for a rule, or a highly demanding, strictly codified way of life. They have made that intense second decision to live by a specific disciplined regula.
Let's look at the friction this creates. If a local bishop, a member of the secular clergy, looks at a highly successful, wealthy monastery in his territory and attempts to take over its administration,
or dictate its leadership, or siphon its funds,
that hostile takeover is actually defined as secularization. It is taking a high-disciplined, specialized task force and forcefully subjugating it to the general, lower-discipline demands of the broad community.
Precisely. And in the Middle Ages, this tension culminated in the lengthy and bitter investiture controversy. But ultimately, the regular clergy, the sodalities, fought for and gained clear legal and theological authority to operate semi-autonomously directly under the Pope rather than the local bishops.
They successfully averted that secularization and maintained their distinct missional edge. But let me push back here, because it's easy to paint this era as perfectly harmonious.
Right, it wasn't always smooth.
It wasn't all sunshine and roses. The bishops and the abbots frequently despised each other. They fought over land, over tithes. Wasn't the papacy just a giant centralized bureaucracy running the whole show from the top down?
That is a very common modern misconception, but Winter argues forcefully against it. If you trace the actual history, the real foundational wellsprings of biblical study, of radical obedience, of theological reform,
They were almost always located within the sodalities.
yes, not the Roman hierarchy. The papacy and the vast diocesan structures were often just secondary derivatives, feeding off the vitality generated by the monastic tradition.
Like Pope Hildebrand, Gregory VII. He was one of the most powerful popes in history. But he was a product of the monasteries.
He literally had to take the radical ideals and the fierce commitment of the monastic movement and drag them into the Vatican to reform a corrupt papacy. The pure energy flowed from the sodality up into the modality, never the other way around.
The sodalities were the absolute engines of organizational renewal. They were the private businesses keeping the town's economy alive. Which makes the next phase of our story so incredibly tragic. We are shifting to the Protestant blunder and the resulting 300-year gap.
This is where Winter's thesis delivers its sharpest, most controversial critique of modern church history.
We arrive at the Protestant Reformation. We look at Martin Luther. Now, it is crucial to remember that Luther himself was an Augustinian monk. He belonged to a highly disciplined sodality.
In fact, Winter explicitly points out that it was within the rigorous environment of that very sodality that Luther was introduced to deep biblical scholarship and ultimately to the doctrine of justification by faith.
The sodality formed his entire theological worldview. But when Luther looked out past his monastery walls at the broader diocesan church, the local parishes of his time, he was completely disgusted by how nominal and corrupt they had become.
And his reaction to that intense polarization led him to make what Winter bluntly calls the greatest structural error of the Reformation.
Because Luther was so deeply dissatisfied with the stark contrast between the vital energy of his monastic order and the deadness of the local parishes, he made a catastrophic overcorrection.
He decided to abandon the sodality structure entirely. He dismantled the monasteries in his territories.
Instead, he relied exclusively on political forces, the local princes, and a renewed, reformed diocesan structure to launch and sustain his movement. He attempted to build a global church using only modalities.
He looked at the town and the private businesses, saw that some of the businesses were corrupt, and decided to outlaw private enterprise entirely.
He threw out all the specialized task forces and tried to let the town council run absolutely everything.
That is the perfect operational summary. The Lutheran movement successfully produced a newly reformed diocesan structure, a new modality, but it categorically failed to readopt the sodalities that had driven mission and deep spiritual renewal for the previous 1,000 years.
And the consequence of that single structural decision is absolutely staggering. Winter writes that by failing to exploit the power of the sodality, Protestants essentially lost their mechanism for cross-cultural missions for almost 300 years.
3 entire centuries. While the Catholic sodalities, the Jesuits, the Franciscans were sailing across the globe, reaching the Americas, India, and Japan, the Protestants became this self-contained, structurally impotent European backwater.
It's a devastating structural critique. Without the specialized second decision task forces, the Protestant movement simply couldn't launch complex missions. A local German parish could not figure out the logistics to send a team to Africa.
They had no structural vehicle for it. The modality alone, no matter how pure its theology, was operationally insufficient for frontier mission.
Now, Winter does point out that there were a few crucial stopgaps that kept the Protestant spirit from totally stagnating internally during those 3 centuries.
Right, he mentions the Pietist movement as a prime example. The Pietist tradition in Germany was essentially the organic reemergence of a sodality within the confines of Protestantism.
It consisted of adults meeting together in small, highly disciplined groups, committing to intense Bible study.
But crucially, they did this without conflicting with the stated meetings of the existing state church. They formed a sodality of the heart that operated quietly within the modality.
And we see this exact mechanism perfected structurally by John Wesley. John Wesley is such a brilliant case study. He essentially created high-discipline sodalities, these intense small groups, classes, and bands of highly committed adults.
But he absolutely prohibited them from abandoning their local Anglican parish churches. He built a potent sodality specifically designed to inject lifeblood back into the modality.
And Winter even provides a massive modern parallel to this dynamic. The East African revival, which involved over 1 million people functioning in the exact same way, revitalizing existing churches without breaking away.
However, Winter issues a strong warning here. He notes that these internal renewal movements, like the Pietists, often suffer a very predictable organizational fate.
Over time, usually across a generation or 2, they lose their intense edge.
They drop back down to the level of biological growth. They revert from the high discipline sodality level back down to the generalized modality level, and the renewing fire goes out.
Now, this brings up a really fascinating structural middle ground that I want us to spend significant time unpacking. Because if you are listening to this and you work for a rescue mission, a city mission, or the Salvation Army, this next concept is going to explain the core tension of your daily professional life.
Oh, absolutely. The text mentions the Anabaptist and Mennonite movements, alongside the Salvation Army, as these incredibly significant experiments that attempt to stand midway between a modality and a sodality.
Yes, this is one of Winter's most brilliant observations. Let's analyze the mechanics of the Salvation Army. When William Booth founded it, it demanded an incredibly high level of discipline.
It required a very specific, intense vocational and missional commitment to dive into the absolute worst urban poverty in London.
It possessed the intense selectivity, the strict hierarchy, and the extreme vitality of a pure sodality. It was deeply a believer's church. You had to make a radical, life-altering second decision to put on that uniform and march into the slums.
But at the exact same time, they weren't just a band of celibate monks living in a cloister.
Right. The Salvation Army included whole families. People met, married, and had children within the movement. it quickly developed the biological constituency of a modality.
You had grandparents, parents, and infants all integrated into this intense missional lifestyle. It is structurally paradoxical. It is like trying to run a typical suburban town using the strict discipline of a forward-deployed military base.
Precisely. They are attempting a monumental balancing act, preserving a high, radical form of Christianity through biological transmission, while simultaneously maintaining the bleeding edge of a specialized frontline mission.
It is a structurally fascinating midway point. But Winter highlights the severe historical danger of this model. When a group has the constituency of a modality, meaning it relies on families and biological growth, the immense challenge is maintaining that initial sodality vitality generation after generation.
Because the children who are born into the Salvation Army or raised in the halls of a rescue mission haven't necessarily made that same radical, costly second decision that their parents made when they founded the movement. They're just living there.
Exactly. And so the structural gravity of human nature constantly pulls these midway experiments back toward being a standard, generalized modality. The focus inevitably shifts from how do we rescue the dying in the streets to how do we provide a good youth group for our teenagers?
If you are running a rescue mission today, that tension is your daily reality. You feel the pull between balancing deep, compassionate community care for your staff's families with the radical, exhausting demands of frontline urban rescue.
That friction isn't a sign that you are failing as a leader. It is baked into the very DNA of trying to operate a midway structure.
It demands constant, exhausting, intentional renewal of that second decision for every single new generation, or you will slowly morph into just another comfortable local church that happens to have a nice soup kitchen attached to it.
It explains the life cycle of so many incredible urban mission movements. They start with the blazing fire of a sodality, and unless they aggressively fight to keep the mission edge sharp, they slowly settle into the broad, comfortable care of a modality.
Okay, let's pull back to the broader Protestant historical timeline. The Protestants have been structurally stuck, operating without a true, dedicated, cross-cultural mission sodality for nearly 300 years.
Trapped in their local modalities.
And then, everything changes because of a single pamphlet.
A single, relatively short publication alters the entire global trajectory of Protestantism. In 1792, a man named William Carey, who was a bivocational cobbler and a relatively obscure Baptist pastor, published a pamphlet titled An Inquiry.
The full title is quite long, but the critical phrase he uses focuses on the use of means for the conversion of the heathen.
The use of means. It sounds incredibly dry and theological to our modern ears, but Winter points out that this specific phrase was organizationally revolutionary.
What did Carey actually mean by means?
Carey was using the word means as structural code for a sodality. He was arguing against immense theological opposition from his own modality leaders that Protestants needed to create an organized, non-ecclesiastical initiative of warm-hearted volunteers.
He realized that the local church modality, by its very nature, governance, and funding structure, was not equipped to launch complex, long-distance, cross-cultural missions.
They needed a dedicated secondary vehicle. They needed to invent a Protestant mission society.
And we have to remember the pushback Carey got. When he first proposed this, the older modality leaders essentially told him, "Sit down, young man. When God wants to convert the heathen, he will do it without your help or ours."
The town didn't want the private business to exist, but Carey pushed through, and the response to his pamphlet was like dropping a match into a 300-year-old powder keg.
The Protestant world possessed 3 centuries of latent, pent-up spiritual energy, and Carey finally handed them the structural vehicle required to release it.
The resulting explosion of missions was historically unprecedented. Carey helped form the Baptist Missionary Society, and within just 32 years, 12 massive, similar societies were formed.
The London Missionary Society, the Church Missionary Society, the American Board, wave after wave of these new, highly organized sodalities were birthed, funded by voluntary subscriptions, and deployed across the globe.
It launched what the great historian Kenneth Scott Latourette famously called the Great Century. Winter says that in the 19th century alone, Protestants caught up with 18 entire centuries of earlier Catholic mission work.
They transformed from a structurally handicapped European backwater into a massive global force. And here's the crucial takeaway. It wasn't because their internal theology suddenly changed.
No, it was because they finally recovered the organizational tool of the sodality.
That is Winter's central thesis proven in real time. Organizationally, the vehicle that allowed the Protestant movement to become globally vital was the sodality. It successfully harvested the latent voluntarism that had always existed in Protestantism but had no outlet.
By 1840, this network of independent mission sodalities was so prominent and well-funded in the United States that historians referred to it as the evangelical empire.
But of course, history repeats itself. Whenever a sodality gets too successful, whenever the private business starts making too much money and gaining too much influence, the modality starts getting uncomfortable.
The town council gets jealous, which brings us to the final major shift in our story, a contemporary misunderstanding and the resulting field tragedy. The friction returns with a vengeance.
Keep our analogy of the town and the private business in mind here. In the early 19th century, these new, explosive mission societies were largely independent.
Brilliant leaders like Henry Venn at the Church Missionary Society and Rufus Anderson at the American Board championed the idea of the semi-autonomous mission sodality. They believed the town should let the businesses run themselves, trusting their specialized expertise.
But gradually, human nature, organizational gravity, and the desire for control took over. The denominations, the modalities started looking at these highly successful, well-funded mission societies and said, hey, all those donors are church members, we should probably be in charge of that money.
Winter specifically points to the Presbyterian denominational leaders in America as gaining significant ground in pushing this centralizing perspective. They shifted their posture.
They no longer wanted to merely regulate the sodality.
Right. They wanted to directly administer them. They wanted to absorb the independent mission boards into unified denominational budgets controlled by the church's central governance.
So what does this all mean? Let's break down the mechanics of this, because I want the listener to understand exactly why a unified budget is a death sentence for specialized mission.
Okay, let's walk through a hypothetical scenario.
Imagine you are sitting in a church elder board meeting. You control the unified budget. On the table, you have two requests for $50,000.
Request A is to fix the leaking roof of the sanctuary, which is dripping on the youth group during Wednesday night service.
And request B is to fund a specialized urban rescue mission planting a new drug rehab center 3 cities away. Both are valid needs. But who are the elders accountable to?
They are accountable to the congregation sitting under the leaky roof. Winter gives a very stern, mathematically inevitable economic warning here. A Christian modality inevitably represents the general, mostly inward-facing concerns of a huge body of diverse members.
These are first-decision Christians. They legitimately need a new roof, they need a better youth pastor, they need local pastoral care.
When a high-discipline, outward-focused mission sodality falls under the complete administrative control and democratic majority of that general modality, the focus inevitably turns inward.
The town council votes to tax the bakery's profits to fix the local potholes, and the bakery slowly goes out of business.
Exactly. And the historical result, proven over the last century, is that denominational mission budgets inevitably, predictably shrink across the decades as the church membership broadens its internal demands. The high-discipline mission gets completely watered down by the generalized needs of the modality.
And this attempted structural takeover caused a massive rebellion in the late 19th century, didn't it?
It did. It sparked the rise of what became known as the faith missions movement. Men like Hudson Taylor and his China Inland Mission are the prime examples.
They saw the denominations getting bogged down in committee meetings and budget cuts, so they burst onto the scene, completely ignoring denominational control.
Winter points out this wasn't really a new invention. It was just a recrudescence, a fierce return to the older independent sodality pattern from the beginning of Carey's century.
Hudson Taylor basically said, "You unified budgets are killing the mission. We are forming a pure autonomous sodality. We are trusting God for the funds directly, and we are heading deep into the interior of China."
And that profound tension between denominational boards wanting control and independent mission agencies demanding autonomy continues to cause deep confusion and bitter arguments among Protestants to this very day.
Many local church leaders still don't understand structurally why independent mission agencies or rescue missions need to exist separately. They falsely believe that centralized church control is the only biblically proper pattern.
This raises an important question, which leads us directly to what Winter considers the deepest, most heartbreaking, and most consequential tragedy in his entire essay.
The tragic organizational blindness on the mission field itself.
Yes. This is where the structural misunderstanding inflicts the most global damage. Because modern Protestant missionaries are overwhelmingly modality-minded, because they have been taught that the local church is the only valid structure. They go overseas or they go into the inner city, and they work incredibly hard to plant local churches.
They plant modalities, which To be clear, is a good thing. We need modalities.
It is absolutely essential. But the tragedy is that these missionaries are completely blind to the fact that they themselves, the mission agency that funded them, trained them, and sent them, are a sodality.
They operate within a highly specialized sodality structure that didn't exist in Protestantism for 300 years, a structure without which they couldn't even survive on the field for a month.
Yet when they train the new local believers in these foreign countries, they only teach them how to build modalities.
Wow. Think about the hypocrisy of that, even if it's unintentional. They use a powerful, well-funded sodality to reach the field, but they refuse to leave a sodality behind.
They just leave a network of local churches and tell them, okay, now you go reach the rest of your continent.
And the result is that these young, vibrant churches are left structurally handicapped from birth. They are left without the specialized sodality structures they desperately need to launch their own cross-cultural missions.
They're expected to evangelize massive, complex regions using only the local parish model, which, as 2,000 years of history clearly demonstrates, is nearly impossible.
Winter writes that these younger churches are having to figure out the mechanics of specialized mission with embarrassingly little help or encouragement from Western agencies.
But the overarching point remains a stark warning. Until we recognize the absolute historical necessity of both structures, we will continue to inadvertently handicap the global Christian movement.
Which brings us to the end of our journey today. Let's just recap the epic scope of what we've unpacked. We didn't just read a list of events. We tracked the mechanical engine of church history.
From Paul's bands to Carey's pamphlet.
Right. We started with Paul's traveling, self-funded bands operating outside the synagogue. We moved to the Roman monks clearing forests and preserving civilization when the diocese crumbled.
We examined the delicate, 1,000-year medieval synthesis of secular bishops and regular abbots.
We saw Luther accidentally destroy the Protestant sodality, plunging them into a 300-year missional dark age. And finally, we saw William Carey recover that exact same tool, unleashing the massive modern mission movement, only to see denominations try to drag it back under the leaky roof of the unified budget.
The historical pattern is undeniable, and the operational lesson is clear. God uses both structures. The modality, the inclusive biological family, the local church, the town is absolutely essential for nurturing, preserving, and maintaining the community. You cannot survive without the town.
But the sodality, the high discipline, second decision task force, the specialized agency, the private business, is equally essential for breaking new ground, for radical renewal, and for executing complex, sustained, dangerous missions. Both are legitimate. Both are necessary.
And so I want to connect this directly back to you, the listener, right where you work today. The next time you are sitting in a staff meeting at a massive community organization, a mega church, or a broad nonprofit, and you feel incredibly frustrated by the glacial pace, the endless committees, and the constant inward focus.
Or conversely, the next time you are working your shift in an intense, specialized urban rescue mission and you are facing total burnout because you lack broad community support and funding, I want you to remember this delicate balance.
Remember the town and the private business. Understand the structure you are currently operating in, recognize its inherent strengths, and make peace with its unavoidable limitations.
Recognize that the friction you feel isn't necessarily a sign of leadership failure or spiritual decay. It is often the natural, healthy byproduct of these two necessary structures rubbing against each other.
The goal isn't to eliminate one in favor of the other, but to actively fight to achieve that harmony where both can thrive, respecting and supporting each other's unique, God-given functions.
I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over as you head back to work. We started this deep dive talking about the muddy waters of organizational structures and how we desperately long for the clean precision of a single centralized blueprint.
Which doesn't exist.
Right. But if 2,000 years of history definitively proves that sodalities, these specialized, high-commitment, second decision bands, are the true, unmatched engines of radical organizational renewal, we have to ask ourselves a difficult, almost dangerous question. Is the modern local church, as it is currently structured, fundamentally incapable of driving major radical global change entirely on its own? And if that is true, if you absolutely need that specialized vehicle to truly change your city or the world, what second decision are you waiting to make? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We will see you next time.